Mark Lackey is Executive VP of CHF Capital Markets, and over the break, Mark and I were talking about gold and how I said it was going to go down. And he had admitted that it was going to go down to $12.50.
Right.
So from now on, if it goes lower, I'm right.
That's right.
And you're wrong.
And in the short run, you could very well be right.
You've had a great call on palladium.
Yeah, it's interesting, Pat. A lot of the guys on the street would say that if gold goes one way, palladium follows, because it is a precious metal.
Right.
Except palladium has a lot of other industrial uses, and there are other supply issues. Because we always tell people, judge every commodity individually, not on how you think it relates to other commodities. And this is a perfect example. And palladium this time last year, well, it was around what? We've gone up almost $180, $200 an ounce here, up to the 830 range, and I think it was about 640 last June. So we did think we were going to see a pretty nice move. Most of the people on the street thought go sideways or up slightly, and in fact, if anything, Pat, we see 850 to 860 by the end of the year and 925 next year.
Okay, so now let's talk about the uses. Industrial catalytic converters primarily?
That's the big one, Pat, and people say, well, and the big issue, of course, has been China's not only growing its automobile production quickly, but they've increased their air standard quality. So you now have catalytic converters in Chinese cars that are pretty similar to what we have here. So as a consequence, that's been a big increase in demand for palladium. The other thing that's helped palladium has been the restriction of gold imports into India. And it's forced jewelers to move to white gold. Now, white gold, for some of the people who are watching, may not realize this, but that's not gold. That's actually palladium. So the palladium demand
not entirely. It's a mix, isn't it?
It's a mix. Yeah, fair enough. It is a mix, Pat. And the mix can vary on the type of white gold you're buying. But in some cases, in India in particular, the mix is very largely palladium, hardly any gold. Whereas that's not so much the case here in North America. So, and the other factor is that more palladium is now being used in things like petrochemical refining and oil refining. So we're seeing another actual additional demand area. So we're seeing pretty good demand for palladium. And then, as we know, Pat, there's a number of supply issues out there in terms of palladium.
You mentioned jewelry in India. A lot of people started talking about jewelry in China as well, as the wealth factor kicks in there.
There's no question. Now, there doesn't seem to be the same buying in China on white gold as there is in India, but it is changing, admittedly, because China hasn't restricted gold imports. But nevertheless, you're right. People who want to get something that's cheaper, and in some cases, middle-class people who maybe don't have as much money as the very well-off in China, have been buying more palladium-based jewelry. So you're right about that.
Okay, let's get to the supply side of the equation, because you and I didn't. We've discussed Russia. I think it was about 6 or 8 months ago.
Yep.
We didn't see Ukraine even on the horizon at the time. Does that change things?
Well, it does to some degree, Pat. I mean, so far I haven't exactly seen a lot of restrictions by the Western countries on Russian mining. But even before the Ukraine, we were seeing the Russian supply kind of going sideways. And the other problem, of course, is South Africa is the biggest producer of palladium. They've got electricity problems there, and of course there are other labor and political issues these days. So when your two biggest areas in the world by far have not exactly been growing their supply, clearly there's going to be upward pressure on price. And we don't see that supply from those two countries growing at all in the next couple of years.
Okay, so how do I make money out of this? Wallbridge Mining Company is when you're coming forward.
Now, Wallbridge, Pat, I like what these guys have done. They've stayed the course. When people said that there's nothing left in Sudbury, guess what? You still have opportunities in Sudbury, Timmins, and many of these places in Canada. They found some pretty decent-sized palladium, and they'll be shipping their first ore in the next month. So kudos to them to hang in there for a number of years, get to the point now where they are going to be effectively a producer within the next month. Good management team, good board, and obviously I like the jurisdiction.
Okay, when it's trading at something like 8 cents, are enough people paying attention to that?
No, that's a very good point. It's a stock that's well below radars for whatever reason. It's one of the reasons why I'm on here talking about it, because frankly, I'm trying to get people to look at companies like this. They also own part of Duluth. They own about 8% of Duluth, which is a palladium platinum play in Minnesota, and trades around 65, 70 cents. So it doesn't look like the market's giving them a whole lot of value for something they actually own. So, yeah, I mean, other people have said to me, well, how many people follow palladium? True, it's not as widely followed, but given where it's going, people should be starting to follow it more, given the economics behind the metal.
And the next one is interesting because it's North American, Wellgreen Platinum.
Yeah, now they're a platinum and palladium play, and they're actually got a decent nickel deposit. They're up in the Yukon.
Oh.
But they're in the part of the Yukon that has infrastructure. Remember, if
like
you're up,
roads?
yeah, well, you got plenty of roads, you've got port facilities. Parts of the Yukon are pretty desolate, okay? And, there's not even power availability. But if you're up near Whitehorse, then you're okay, because the infrastructure there, and there's been a long mining history, of course, in the Yukon. It's a pretty friendly and pro-mining jurisdiction, especially if you're in areas that are traditionally mining, as opposed to maybe pristine areas where there's no mining. So these guys have done a good job. Now, this is more of a greenfields play of the ones I've got here today, because they are not in production yet. They're going to have another additional analysis come out in July. And so let's see how that turns out. But I like the fact, Pat, that the recent drilling results have looked very good. So I think this has got a huge potential play, and again, very good management team and a jurisdiction I like.
Do the stocks often move before you get the cash flow of actually mining?
Pat, if you get some really good drilling results and people see that there's a pretty significant resource, then that certainly can move the stock. Absolutely. Some stocks really do have to wait until they're produced, but others, when people can see that this is potentially a pretty big play, and then might interest somebody like a Stillwater, who have bought some palladium plays here in Canada, the biggest palladium player in the world. They've been in Ontario, they've been in the north. So you're likely trying in this situation to get people to look at you as a potential takeout candidate as well.
Okay. And the last one you've got is North American Palladium. And I think we talked about this one last time.
And North American Palladium, Pat, is a producer. Their cash costs are in just under $5. They've got the cash costs in under $500 an ounce now. So their EBITDA in the last quarter looked pretty good. I think that, again, these guys have been around for a while. People have said, well, until palladium really moves, I'm not interested. Well, palladium is now moving, and these guys have got potentially to have a pretty good margin here. And I think they're doing a lot of good work in terms of lowering their costs as well. So another stock that seems to be somewhat off people's radar screens, but I think it's time to look at palladium given where we think this market's going.
Yeah, I missed the stock price when it went up there. Has it moved?
It's pretty much sideways, Pat. It's another one of those that hasn't really moved much given...
Even though the underlying commodities moved 30%.
Yep.
Wow, incredible. Yeah. Mark, always great to have you here.
It's great to be here, Pat.
Although next week you might regret that $12.50 on the gold thing. We'll see. I don't think it'll happen that fast, quite frankly. Mark Lackey joining us, CHF Capital Markets. Quick break.